What's up guys, and welcome to today's video where we're going to discuss the equipment rebalancing in the current range meta in the game. There was a massive blog released today on the Old School homepage, and in today's video I'm going to give you a very simplified, much shorter version of this entire news blog post, allowing you to get the main gist of the problem without having to go through and take 30 minutes to read this thing. First things first, we start out with the current range meta, and this should be no surprise. The current heavyweights in the range meta are the Toxic Blowpipe as well as the T-Bow. The only other one you can kind of put in this conversation would probably be the Heavy Ballista, but this is purely in terms of PvP rather than PvM. Quickly before we do jump in, I do want to highlight the fact that they plan on releasing all of these equipment rebalances that they originally proposed all together in 4 separate releases. Something I'm very happy about, considering the fact that we were going to go from a overpowered blowpipe to a blowpipe shooting potatoes in a matter of weeks, and there was like no feedback window that was ever going to exist. Thankfully, they did kind of take a step back and decided to let the players have a little bit more opinion in the process before throwing an update down their throats and then having to go back on it after the update had already been implemented and then making changes. In addition to that, I imagine the more complicated one, like this current range meta update, will probably be the 4th of the 4 releases. But now moving on to kind of the whole purpose of this blog, and that is basically the current range meta and why it needs an adjustment. And the main reason for this is the Toxic Blowpipe, along slightly with the T-Bow, which are currently both only tier 75 range weapons, which is the highest we do have in Old School. But with just being a tier 75, the Blowpipe is incredibly strong. And not only is it strong, but it's also usable everywhere, and it comes incredibly cheap, between like 3 and 5 mil. And depending on the darts, it may not even be that expensive to use. Ultimately applying a lot of pressure in terms of the current Old School game and its future outlook in terms of power creep, where it wants to go with future items and future bosses. The current Blowpipe at its low tier and low cost, paired with its current strength, is ultimately a recipe that doesn't allow for a lot of future expansion in terms of the ranging skill for OSRS. And ultimately that's really the whole purpose of this video, this blog, and the adjustments that they feel that need to happen in order for Old School to continue on a healthy growth for years to come. The T-Bow is also touched on in these rebalancing blogs, but ultimately I think the adjustment to just removing the prayer bonus and making it a tier 85 weapon rather than 75 just completely solves the problem in terms of where the T-Bow is in the current meta. Makes it a higher requirement to use. It is already locked behind a massive price of 1 bill plus. And you can even adjust future bosses in order to make them resistant to the T-Bow if you do want, because as everybody knows, unless you are a new player, the T-Bow's accuracy and damage is greatly associated with your target's magic level or magic accuracy. Therefore, any new content that Old School wants to release, if they just make low magic levels or low magic accuracy, they can very intentionally make it resistant to the T-Bow right off the bat. Now, kind of the 2 solutions they felt were possible in terms of what they could do. They could either nerf the Blowpipe so they could introduce more range weapons at tier 75. This would allow them to fill in places where the Blowpipe was previously used, and may even allow some of these newer items to be even better than the Blowpipe already was in some circumstances. And what they mean by this are introducing weapons like the Dragon Hunter crossbow, which for the most part is worse than the Blowpipe unless you're in places like Rune Dragons or Vorkap, or even Brutal Black Dragons, basically any dragons in general. Introducing more items like this where there's a one-off chance that they're just more efficient for that specific monster. And another option they felt was possible was create a new tier above the Blowpipe, although this would unavoidably result in power creep for what is already one of the most dominant playing styles in ranged. Now, the original proposal for the Blowpipe that they released a few weeks ago, or maybe even a couple months ago, at this point I'm not 100% sure, was 100% increased accuracy for the special attack. Base range accuracy would be reduced by half from 60 to 30, and base range strength would be reduced from 40 to 25, as well as all dart variants accuracy and strength would be reduced, and the range level requirement would be bumped from 75 to 78. And the main feedback I kind of heard from a lot of players was that they felt this nerf was slightly too aggressive. And as a result of this original proposition, this is kind of what they highlighted, what worked and what didn't work. And you don't even have to read to understand the fact that what didn't work almost doubled what actually benefited from these adjustments. What they felt worked was that the darts became a much more important factor in terms of your DPS with the blowpipe. It also created a much larger gap between the blowpipe and the T-bow in terms of power, allowing them to fill it with more different rewards over time. It also provided more diversity in the range meta, and it gave the blowpipe a clear identity, allowing it to be the best weapon purely against more low defense targets. But ultimately, what didn't work was the overall power level between the T-bow and the blowpipe was widened considerably, meaning more content felt like it was locked behind a more incredibly expensive item. For example, content like TOB or Chambers of Xeric become drastically different in difficulty depending on the gear you do have. And a couple of the problems were that the changes especially nerfed the player rather than the weapon. There were no immediate replacements for the blowpipe, and there was no public available schedule for any releases of new items coming anywhere in the near future. And this kind of undermined the player's overall confidence in making these changes. Another one of the problems that existed was that while the ranged meta changed, it didn't really change enough to make a noticeable immediate impact. For example, like in-game content, it still revolved around using the blowpipe or the T-bow, but if you didn't have the T-bow, you would still be using the blowpipe. It just happened to be weaker and worse than before. There was still no variant that was better, you just hit less often, and it took longer to kill anything. Meaning rather than just taking some pressure off, this put even more pressure on Jagex and relied heavily on new items being added in the game in the future. So are these changes needed? Does the blowpipe actually need changed 6 years after release? I don't know, let me know down in a comment below what you think. Does the blowpipe need changed this late after it's been released 6 years? Overall, they feel it does in the best interest of the long-term health of the game, and I kind of understand where that's coming from. It comes incredibly difficult to offer any new ranged weapons considering the strength of the current 75 tier weapon that doesn't cost more than 5 mil to acquire. Now let's quickly touch on a concept they proposed, and this was offering different ranged damage types. Similar to stab, slash, and crush for melee, there would be piercing, bludgeoning, and then magic slash special. Meaning that monsters would then be weak rather than to just range, they would be weak to a specific type of ranged combat. And while I think this could definitely impact the power problem of ranged and old school, I feel like it kind of takes away from the old school aspect. As well, it's a massive overhaul considering you have to adjust every single monster in old school in order to make this change. And it seems like a lot of work for a change that some players don't even think needs to happen. And I kind of just want to highlight this chart really quick to show the theoretical max damage per second of the blowpipe and how it stacks up against some of the current weapons. Although I'm not sure what change is going to be the best, I understand the fact that it does need change because in terms of a tier 75 weapon that costs less than 5 mil, it is drastically too strong for the long-term health of the game. For example, a toxic blowpipe with bronze darts right here, this is theoretical max damage per second because it does take into account that your accuracy is 100%. I do want to mention that if you do care anything about statistics, but regardless, the blowpipe with bronze darts has a DPS of 10.41, whereas the highest alternative that isn't the T-bow would be the Carol's crossbow or the MSB with amethyst arrows at 8.05. The highest alternative. You're talking a blowpipe with bronze darts out DPSs a Carol's crossbow, an MSB with amethyst arrows, or even a crystal bow with crystal armor by over 2 damage per second. And while that may not seem like a lot, 2 damage per second in the grand scheme of things is a massive chunk. But that is everything I wanted to cover in this video. If you did make it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider dropping it a like. And if you're around here often and you have not already, subscribe and hit that notification bell. They both massively help out the channel, and thank you guys so much for all the support. With that, if you guys do have a strong opinion on the current range meta or anything in that regard, make sure to head over to the OSRS homepage and scroll all the way down to the bottom of this blog. There is a survey that you can fill out and at least offer some insight on your opinion and how you feel in regards to the current rebalancing that they are proposing. Also, drop me a comment down below what you think. What's your opinion? What do you think of the current range meta? Do you think the blowpipe needs nerfed? Is it too strong? Should they just not change it considering it's already been 6 years? I don't know. I'm incredibly interested to see what you guys have to say. But that's going to do it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.